Greystone was a town frozen in time, its cobblestone streets lined with gaslit lanterns and weathered wooden signs. Olivia, a freelance photographer, had moved there for peace and inspiration. She was drawn to the town's eerie charm, which often made her photos look like windows to another era. Her exploration led her to the outskirts one crisp autumn evening. The golden sun dipped below the horizon as she wandered through an abandoned park, her camera snapping the vivid reds and oranges of the falling leaves. Olivia aimed her lens at the shadowy silhouettes of a row of maple trees, capturing their haunting beauty. But one photo made her stop. In the frame, a figure stood beneath a tree, tall, unnervingly still, and devoid of any facial features. She lowered her camera to glance around. Nothing. No one was there. Olivia dismissed it as a trick of light and continued her walk. The evening grew colder, and the town seemed to exhale a breath of quiet dread. She snapped more pictures of the decaying benches and rusted swings, but when she reviewed the images later at home, her blood ran cold. The figure appeared in every photo, each time closer than the last. Its featureless head turned in her direction, as if watching her. Olivia rubbed her eyes, her heart pounding, and double-checked the photos. The figure was still there. A soft knock on her living room window made her freeze. She spun around, her breath hitching. Outside, the street was empty, bathed in the amber glow of the streetlights. She shook her head and laughed nervously, convincing herself it was the wind. The camera lay on the table, the images glaring back at her. Something felt deeply wrong, but exhaustion overtook her curiosity. She went to bed, but sleep evaded her as whispers floated through the still night, faint but insistent, calling her name. The following morning, Olivia made her way to the general store in the heart of Greystone. It was an old-fashioned establishment, with shelves crammed full of canned goods, jars of candy, and trinkets. Behind the counter stood Henry, a wiry man in his late 60s, whose eyes seemed to hold secrets. "You're new in town," Henry remarked, his voice tinged with a cautious warmth. Olivia nodded, explaining her move and her love for photography. She hesitated, then decided to bring up the strange figure in her photos. Henry's demeanor shifted instantly. His hand gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening. "You've seen it," he said in a near whisper. "Seen what?" Olivia asked, her pulse quickening. "The Faceless Wanderer," Henry said, leaning closer. "It shows itself when you've caught its attention. Once it does, it won't stop until—" His words trailed off, leaving a grim silence. Olivia chuckled nervously, hoping to dispel the growing tension. "You're messing with me, right? Some kind of local legend to scare outsiders?" Henry's expression remained grave. "It's no joke. That thing has been here longer than anyone. It doesn't kill outright. It makes you lose yourself, piece by piece. You'll hear whispers, see it in reflections, feel it in your dreams, and if you ever face it directly—" He shuddered and looked away. Before Olivia could ask more, another customer entered, and Henry stepped back, his face shutting like a locked door. Confused but intrigued, Olivia left the store, her mind spinning. The streets seemed quieter than usual, the air heavier. She decided to distract herself by revisiting the park where she had first seen the figure. Arriving at the park, the atmosphere was different, still and oppressive, as if the air itself was holding its breath. As Olivia raised her camera to capture the same row of trees, she froze. The figure was there again. Not in her camera this time, but standing beneath the same tree, staring directly at her with its faceless head. She blinked, and it was gone. Her heart raced as she stumbled back to her car. Henry's warning echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she wondered if she'd stumbled into something far darker than she'd imagined. That night, Olivia couldn't shake the image of the faceless figure from her mind. Every shadow in her room seemed to stretch and contort unnaturally, as if mocking her growing paranoia. She clutched her camera on the nightstand, its weight oddly comforting. At around 2 a.m., faint, deliberate footsteps echoed from outside her bedroom window. They were soft, measured, and far too close to be passing traffic. Olivia's breath hitched as she listened intently, her heart pounding in her ears. Summoning courage, she tiptoed to the window and peeked through the curtains. The street was empty, bathed in the dim orange glow of the streetlights. A breeze rustled the autumn leaves, but there was no sign of movement. She sighed in relief, shaking her head at her own imagination. Turning back to her room, she froze. In the mirror hanging across the wall, something wasn't right. The reflection didn't match the room behind her. Her throat tightened as she squinted at the faint shape in the glass. There it was. The figure. It stood silently in the corner of the mirror, taller than she remembered. Its faceless head was slightly tilted as if observing her. Olivia spun around, but the corner was empty. Gasping, she turned back to the mirror. The figure was closer now. It didn't walk or move, it simply was. A faint, guttural whisper began emanating from the mirror. Though Olivia couldn't make out the words, the sound chilled her to her core. She screamed, yanking the blanket over her head like a frightened child. Minutes passed, then hours. Olivia dared to peek out again. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered in the suffocating silence. Sleep was impossible. The whispers faded only when the first light of dawn spilled into her room. By morning, Olivia's mind was made up. She needed answers. Whatever the figure was, it had targeted her, and she had no choice but to uncover its secrets. The following morning, Olivia arrived at the general store. The warm smell of aged wood and dust greeted her as she pushed the creaky door open. Henry was nowhere to be seen, but the young shopkeeper from the previous day, a stern-faced woman with piercing eyes, stood behind the counter. "Is Henry here?" Olivia asked, her voice tight. The woman shook her head. "He's been feeling unwell. What do you need?" Olivia hesitated, then pointed toward the shelf where she'd seen the journal. "There's a book over there. An old journal. I need to look at it again." The woman frowned. "That's not for sale. It's been here for decades. Nobody touches it." Ignoring her protest, Olivia approached the shelf. She found the journal nestled between two dusty encyclopedias. Its leather cover was cracked, and its pages were yellowed with age. Flipping it open, she skimmed the entries. The first few pages were mundane, detailing the life of a woman named Eleanor who had moved to Greystone in the early 1900s. But the tone shifted dramatically in the later entries. Eleanor described a faceless figure that appeared in her photographs and reflections. "It stands in the shadows, watching, waiting," one entry read. "It speaks in whispers, words I cannot understand. It grows closer every day." Olivia's hands shook as she turned the pages. The final entry was scrawled in frantic handwriting. "It's inside now. I can't escape. If you're reading this, beware. Don't look at it directly." The words sent a chill down Olivia's spine. She clutched the journal tightly, determined to take it home. "You can't take that," the shopkeeper said sharply. "I'll pay you double," Olivia insisted. "No." The woman's expression hardened. "That book is cursed. If you value your life, leave it here." Olivia hesitated, her resolve faltering. Reluctantly, she placed the journal back on the shelf, but she couldn't shake the feeling that its contents were her only clue to surviving the nightmare she was now living. As she left the store, the air outside felt heavier, colder. She glanced back at the window and froze. The Wanderer was there, its faceless form standing behind the glass, staring at her. Olivia spent the rest of the day indoors, trying to make sense of what she had read in the journal. Her laptop was open on the kitchen table, displaying internet search results for legends or myths surrounding Greystone. There was almost nothing, just brief mentions of the town's isolation and a few vague stories of unexplained disappearances. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a message from her mother, asking how she was settling in. Olivia started to reply but paused when she saw something strange. In the reflection on her phone screen, a shadow passed behind her. She turned sharply, her breath catching, but the room was empty. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Ever since the park incident, Olivia had felt as though she was being watched. That evening, she reviewed the photos she'd taken earlier in the week. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through them. The Wanderer was in every single shot. In some, it was a faint silhouette in the distance. In others, it was disturbingly close, standing in doorways or peeking from behind trees. Olivia's heart raced as she clicked through the images. The Wanderer didn't have a face, yet its presence radiated malice. She tried deleting the photos, but they reappeared moments later, as though mocking her. Then, the footsteps began again, soft and deliberate, echoing through her empty house. Olivia froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound grew louder, closer, stopping just outside the kitchen door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The reply was a whisper, low and guttural, coming from just beyond the doorframe. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent shivers down her spine. Summoning her courage, Olivia grabbed a kitchen knife and edged toward the door. When she flung it open, the hallway was empty. But something caught her eye. A faint, dark smudge on the floor. It resembled a footprint, but it was too large, too warped to belong to any human. Shaking, Olivia retreated to her bedroom, locking the door and barricading it with a chair. She spent the night sitting on her bed, clutching the knife, as the footsteps resumed, circling her house like a predator stalking its prey. The days following the unsettling events blurred together. Olivia tried to shake off the sense of dread, but it clung to her like a second skin. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, the figure's presence was inescapable. It began to appear in more than just reflections. As she passed by storefront windows, she saw its shadow lurking just beyond her peripheral vision, always a step behind her. When she tried to look directly, it vanished. Yet the feeling remained, a constant chill creeping down her spine. One evening, she decided to confront it head-on. Armed with a flashlight and her camera, she ventured to the park where she had first encountered the Wanderer. The night was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As she walked deeper into the park, the shadows seemed to grow longer, more oppressive. Olivia's breath quickened as she passed the spot where she had seen the figure. Her camera clicked in rapid succession, capturing the emptiness around her. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered, plunging her into darkness. Her pulse quickened as the sound of footsteps echoed through the park, soft and measured, just like before. "Who's there?" Olivia called, her voice shaking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, a cold whisper filled the air. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. She aimed her flashlight in the direction of the noise, but the beam revealed only the empty, moonlit path ahead. Panicking, she turned to flee, but when she glanced back, the Wanderer was there, standing at the edge of her flashlight's glow, its featureless face now visible in the beam. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to pulse with a menacing energy. Olivia snapped a photo. She had to capture it. The moment she did, the figure lunged forward, its shadow stretching unnaturally long. With a scream, Olivia ran, the footsteps following her, growing louder and closer until they were all she could hear. The days after the park encounter felt like a blur, as if Olivia were trapped in a waking nightmare. The Wanderer had followed her back to her home, and no matter where she went, she could feel its cold presence lurking just beyond the corners of her vision. The photos she took, each more disturbing than the last, seemed to be her only connection to reality. But even they were starting to blur, becoming warped, as though the figure's influence was seeping into the very fabric of her existence. Desperate for answers, Olivia returned to the town library, hoping to find something that might explain what was happening. The musty scent of old books filled the air as she sifted through rows of forgotten volumes. Her eyes fell on an obscure book titled The Faceless Ones, Legends of Greystone. She pulled it from the shelf with trembling hands and began flipping through its pages. The book detailed the history of Greystone, from its founding to the inexplicable disappearances that had plagued the town for generations. Olivia's eyes widened as she read about an ancient curse that had been placed on the land. The curse spoke of a faceless entity, an ancient spirit, born from the collective fear and sorrow of those who had lived and died in Greystone. The figure, known as the Wanderer, was said to be an eternal tormentor, feeding on the fears of those it followed. It could not be seen clearly, only glimpsed from the corners of one's eyes, but it would grow stronger over time. As Olivia continued to read, she discovered that the Wanderer had never been defeated. Instead, it was bound to the land by an old ritual, one that had been long forgotten. The curse could only be broken if someone willingly took its place. The last person to try had vanished without a trace. Olivia's heart sank. There was no way to escape the figure. It was too powerful. Torn between despair and determination, Olivia scoured the book for any hint of a solution. The answer came in the form of a ritual, one that required a sacrifice, a life given to the Wanderer in exchange for freedom. But the consequences were dire. The ritual had a price, and there was no guarantee it would work. As she closed the book, a shadow crossed the library windows. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. The Wanderer was here, watching her, waiting for her to make her choice. Olivia could feel her pulse racing as she closed the book with trembling hands. The shadows outside the library window seemed to stretch in unnatural ways, as though the darkness itself were alive, waiting for her decision. The air around her grew heavy, suffocating, and her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. The ritual described in the book offered one final, desperate chance to end the terror. It sounded simple on the surface, a willing sacrifice to the Wanderer, but the consequences were far too great. If Olivia performed the ritual, she could rid herself of the entity that haunted her, but at the cost of someone else's life. She had no idea who she could offer, or how to even begin the ritual. But what frightened her the most was the realization that, eventually, the Wanderer would demand a sacrifice of her own. It wasn't just a curse, it was a hunger, an insatiable need to feed on fear and death. Her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind her. She turned, but the library was empty. The whispers from the darkened corners of the room grew louder, and the temperature dropped, sending chills down her spine. Olivia's breath quickened as she realized the figure was inside the library, circling her, moving with an unnatural silence. She could feel its presence in every corner of the room, its faceless form looming just beyond the edge of her vision. She had no idea how much time she had left. Panic flooded her senses. The ritual had to be done. She didn't have much time before the Wanderer would claim her. With trembling hands, she pulled the book back toward her and skimmed the ritual instructions once more. It was a matter of time, of choosing a sacrifice. But who? Suddenly the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, and Olivia felt her skin prickle with cold sweat. A shape appeared in the corner of her eye. Turning toward it, she found herself face to face with the Wanderer, standing in the very center of the library. It stood motionless, but the cold, inescapable gaze of its faceless head bore into her soul, suffocating her. "You must choose," it whispered, its voice scraping against her mind. "Your life or another's." Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as the Wanderer loomed before her, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The creature's faceless form exuded a malevolent energy, and its whisper 1,000 voices at once slinked into her mind, coaxing her toward the ritual. "You cannot escape me," it rasped, its cold, inhuman voice sending shivers down her spine. "You are bound to me now. Choose." Her breath came in shallow gasps. She wasn't sure whether the fear was from the creature itself or from the terrible decision she had to make. The book lay open before her on the library table, its pages fluttering in the stagnant air. The ritual required a blood offering, a willing soul to take her place. Olivia's mind reeled. Who could she sacrifice? Her mind raced through images of people she knew, family, friends, acquaintances, but each one seemed more impossible than the last. She had no one she could willingly condemn to this cursed fate. But in that moment, a thought crossed her mind, a solution she had been avoiding. Her thoughts turned inward, to the only person left to choose, herself. Her hands trembled as she reached for the dagger that the book had recommended, its blade glinting eerily in the dim light of the library. She didn't want to, but she knew she had no choice. The Wanderer would not relent until she made her sacrifice. As she lifted the dagger, the whispers around her grew louder, urging her to act quickly. "It is the only way," the voices urged, each one more frantic than the last. Olivia hesitated. If she sacrificed herself, the Wanderer would be satisfied. But would it truly be over? Or would the creature's hunger simply find another victim to feast upon? The thought paralyzed her. The darkness of the library seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing inward. Just as her resolve wavered, a vision flashed in front of her, an image of her mother, safe and sound, far away from this nightmare. That was when Olivia realized the only way to end this torment was not through self-sacrifice, but through something far more horrifying. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. The ritual had to be completed, but not with her life. Olivia's hand tightened around the dagger, its cold steel digging into her palm as the Wanderer circled her. The whispers in the room grew frantic, louder with every passing second. The air was thick with malice, pressing down on her, suffocating her thoughts. But Olivia's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to give in to fear. The creature wanted her to choose, her life or another's, but she had found her way around that choice. She would not sacrifice herself, and she would not sacrifice anyone else. With a swift motion, Olivia raised the dagger high. The Wanderer froze, its faceless head tilting in curiosity. But instead of plunging the blade into her own heart, Olivia turned it toward the darkened corner of the library. The ritual demanded blood, but it didn't specify whose blood. Without hesitation, she cut her palm, allowing a few drops of her blood to fall onto the floor. The ground beneath her feet seemed to ripple in response, a dark, pulsing energy emanating from the library's floorboards. The Wanderer recoiled, its shadowy form flickering and distorting in the growing darkness. Then, with a primal scream, Olivia shouted the incantation from the book, her voice carrying across the room. I offer my blood to the land, but not my soul. Let the wanderer be bound, never to roam again. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the very air seemed to hum with unnatural energy. The wanderer let out a low, guttural growl, its form flickering in and out of visibility. The shadowy figure seemed to twist and writhe, as though it were being pulled apart by invisible forces. Olivia watched in horror and fascination as the figure grew smaller, its presence weakening. The whispers, once deafening, began to fade into silence. The shadows retreated, pulling away from the walls, as if fleeing from the force Olivia had unleashed. Finally, with a final, agonized howl, the wanderer collapsed in on itself, disintegrating into nothingness. The library fell into an eerie stillness, the tension lifting from the room as though the very air had been cleansed. Olivia's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor. The blood from her hand was still fresh, but the ritual was complete. The curse had been broken, at least for now. She wasn't sure if it would be permanent, but for the first time in weeks, the oppressive weight lifted from her chest. The room was silent, but Olivia knew that the wanderer was gone. The darkness had retreated. As the dawn's first light filtered through the windows, Olivia allowed herself a moment of peace. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.